Today, I know it is freezing outside. At least it's not raining, right? It gives me great pleasure today to introduce today's speaker, UC Irvine Distinguished Professor David Neumark, talking on the long-run effects of the EITC on women's earnings, co-sponsored by UCCS and the UC Irvine Economic Self-Sufficiency Policy Research Institute, or ESPRI for short. Professor Neumark is a distinguished professor of economics and the founding director of ESPRI at UC Irvine. He did his graduate work at Harvard University, earning both a MA and PhD in economics. Over the years, distinguished Professor Neumark has made significant research contributions to the broad study and research of labor economics. His work has been published in over 150 peer-reviewed publications, and he is the author or co-author of 6 books, in addition to as many contributions as author or co-author on book chapters, conference proceedings, special reports, and other publications. His research and policy interests include looking at minimum wage and income distribution, gender differences in labor markets, the economics of aging and age discrimination, and school-to-work programs. Distinguished Professor Neumark's current research agenda, as part of his activities as director of ESPRI, concerns the long-run effects of alternative anti-poverty policies on earnings, income, poverty, and public assistance. In addition to his faculty appointment and directorship at UC Irvine, he has also been a visiting professor abroad and serves as a fellow at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, the Stanford University Center for the Study of Poverty and Inequality, and the IZA Institute for the Study of Labor. Welcome, Distinguished Professor Neumark, to UCCS, and look forward to today's talk. Thank you.
Thanks. Mic is on? Yes, sounds like it. I'm told it takes a minute or two for the mic to get to know me. I'm not sure what that means. When I hear things like that, I realize why I'm so tired. But I love what I do, so I can't complain. So I'm going to speak for around 40 minutes, and then we'll do Q&A. So anything you want to ask about, save it up, and we'll get into it afterwards. So this is joint work with Pete Shirley, a former student, now working at the Luxembourg Income Survey, I don't know what it stands for, LISER, but policy research in Luxembourg on EU issues. And the title is there, Long-Run Effects of the Earning of Tax Credit on Women's Earnings. So I'm going to give you a fair amount of background. This isn't a research seminar, so you don't need to know all the details about how I get to the answers I get to, but I'll give you, I like people to understand roughly how I get there, so I'm not just making up some answer. I want you to understand what the research strategy is. But the background is important here. And this works. There we go. Okay. So what is ESPRI? We'll come up with a shorter name at some point, but for now it's a long name. Well, we're a center funded originally by the Laura and John Arnold Foundation, also supported by the university. And we have as a goal to reorient, and I italicize that word because I want to be very careful to explain what I mean here, to reorient research on anti-poverty policies towards thinking about the longer-term effects. That doesn't mean forgetting about the shorter-term effects, right? There are low-income families who have immediate needs, and we care about what changes in anti-poverty policy do to the resources they have available in the short term, because those matter. But my goal with ESPRI is to also start to complement the great deal of research we have on those sort of short-term questions to thinking about what different anti-poverty policies can do in the longer run. Do they generate economic self-sufficiency? I don't know exactly what that means, but we all have a rough idea what it means. Something to do with increase the capacity for families to earn through their labor, what we would deem an acceptable standard of living. Do they instead breed sort of people getting locked into dependence on government programs? And those are important questions. Whatever your view on what they should or shouldn't do, and what makes what's a desirable outcome, I think we always want to know what the policies actually do, so we can at least make informed decisions. So today I'm going to give you some evidence from a new study on the long-term effects on women's earnings, and I'll give you some more motivation for that. And essentially what this does is it adds onto a very large literature on the EITC. And by the way, there might be a few of you who don't know what the EITC is, so I'll explain it in a minute. But it takes a very large literature that focuses on the short-run effects of the EITC and tries to think about how to estimate the longer run effects of those policies. That's actually, as you might imagine, always a harder question to answer. We don't have as much data studying people for the long term. When we study what happens over 10 or 20 years, a lot of other stuff can happen that maybe isn't actually the effect of the policy. So it's more challenging, but I think it's interesting. So that's what we're trying to do here. Let me just give you, to set the stage, let me just talk about what I view as, I want to kind of say the three main anti-poverty policies. I realize I'm leaving some out, but at least the three main anti-poverty policies that are thought to have a lot to do with people's work behavior. Either trying to increase income from working, or potentially having work incentives that we can shape depending on how we structure the program. And those would be the minimum wage, welfare, and the earned income tax credit. There are obviously other anti-poverty policies, which I think of more as transfers that aren't really tied to work behavior in the same way. Food stamps is sort of a middle ground, right? There's some moderate work search incentives at least built in. I just want to make the point through some examples that we don't know much about long-term effects of any of these policies. So minimum wages, huge literature, hundreds of papers. I've written a lot of them. I'm guilty of adding to those hundreds. Almost all of them are on short-run effects of the minimum wage unemployment of low-skilled workers, whether that be teens or fast food workers or some low-wage group. I mean, to give you an example of short-term, the very famous paper by David Cardinal and Kruger on fast food restaurants in New Jersey and Pennsylvania has a 9-month window. Right? How does employment at the low-skilled change in 9 months? Now, that's interesting for economists testing theories of labor demand, right? Where we have the strong prediction that a higher wage should reduce employment. But if you want to say, is this doing, what is the minimum wage doing? Is it accomplishing certain kinds of goals? Is it bringing people into the workforce? Is it keeping them there? A 9-month window doesn't tell you anything. Not much work on, and this is sort of a criticism of the short-term work, not much work on distributional effects, right? Do we even help low-income families, even in the short term? Much more focused on what does the minimum wage do to teenagers, which I've written a lot on and is from a policy perspective, actually not that interesting, I think. I say to policymakers, so what if the minimum, because these big debates, so let's say the minimum wage does reduce teen employment, which I think the evidence clearly shows it does. It doesn't mean it's a bad idea, right? There may be other things we accomplish with that we want to accomplish. And if you told me the minimum wage throws low-skilled single mothers out of work, that's a much more serious problem because they're supporting their families, right? Upper middle-class teenagers lose their jobs. We may not care. Maybe we'd prefer it. Anyways, that's a different story. What do we know about the long run? Not very much. There's a few papers that look at the effects of minimum wages on training. And the idea is some kinds of training might be reduced by minimum wage. The incentive of an employer or the ability of an employer to offer training might be reduced by a higher minimum wage. And training, labor economists believe, generates wage growth, higher earnings in the long run. So if minimum wages reduce training, that may sort of reduce earnings growth in the long run, which is a bad thing. There's some evidence that if you're exposed to a high minimum, here's a reason you might care more about teenage employment. If you're exposed to a higher minimum wage as a teen, you might have fewer work opportunities, and labor economists also have lots of evidence that the accumulation of work experience is one of the principal engines of wage growth. So foregone opportunities can matter. So there's some evidence on the training evidence is kind of ambiguous, I would say. The evidence on these long-run effects through sort of shutting down work opportunities for young people probably points a little bit in the direction of adverse effects, but hardly decisive, partly because there simply aren't that many studies. What about welfare? Well, despite there being probably more papers on welfare and welfare reform than on the minimum wage, I haven't counted, but that would be my guess, very few focus on long-term effects. There's 2 studies I cite here that were done in the context of welfare reform. Some states in particular really tried, the whole TANF tried to increase work incentives generally through time limits and all. But some states did even more to really try to boost training and work to see if we could make earnings grow. And these 2 papers looked at programs, I think they were both in Florida, that tried to boost the employment and training of people coming off welfare. And they actually did find that these programs could actually boost longer-run earnings growth, not the short term, but in the long term, which one would think about as a move to at least in the direction of economic self-sufficiency. Of course, the sort of the big name and the big piece of work out there that argues that welfare has very bad effects is Charles Murray's famous book, Losing Ground. 73, I think. Whereas he often does, he looks at 2 data points and then tells a very complex story of what's going on. But the 2 data points were kind of compelling. Basically, pointing out that we put in place a lot of anti-poverty programs, welfare-type programs, yet poverty rates, except for declines sort of in Appalachia, haven't really moved very much. So from that observation, which could have a lot of explanations, of course, he went on to say that's because welfare breeds dependency. Right? Once you give people money to not work, some of them don't work as much, and they end up relying on those programs because they never get the earnings growth that could get them off the programs. So I think, termed the phrase, I don't know if he termed it, but he certainly used it a lot, welfare dependency, which is, of course, the opposite of economic self-sufficiency. What about the Earned Income Tax Credit? The EITC, just to give you some information, this is how it works, first of all, for those who don't know. I might have there we go. So this is, think about it, there's 4 lines here. There's childless, ignore that. The EITC now for the childless is small enough to be irrelevant. And then there's the schedule for 1, 2, and since the Great Recession, 3+ children. But just focus on this one, 2 kids, that's the mode, right? That's the most common number of kids to have. So what this is your family income. And what this is how much you get from the government. This is actually a few years old, but it's only gone up with indexation, so the structure is the same. So essentially, the EITC gives you, this federal EITC, if you have 2 kids, a 40% subsidy to your earnings, up to what was then around, a max of around $5,400. Now it's somewhere between, I guess, between 6,000 and 7,000, up to a max. Well, you hit that max. Now you hit it around in the high teens. That's 40%. That's a lot of money, right? So if you make 10,000, you get 4,000 from the government, and then it stays flat for a while. We call this the phase-in range because you get more money as you work more, right? Your check grows. Here it stays flat. We call it the plateau. And then, of course, so we don't all get it, it phases out, right? So that's what the EITC does. This is, in terms of spending, way bigger than what we used to think of and still think of as welfare. It's around $70 to $80 billion a year in spending. I'll show you later. A lot of states supplement it. California, as some of you probably know, very aggressively and is contemplating doing that even more so. That's what the EITC does. And the idea basically is, and I won't go into the economics. If you were taking my undergraduate labor course, you'd hear about this for 2 weeks. But especially on this part of the EITC schedule, there's an unambiguous prediction that people who weren't working will be brought into the labor force because of this, will choose to work, right? And it seems sort of obvious. If your employer is offering you $10 an hour and the government basically makes that $14 an hour, that's a wage that may well induce you to work. That's the theory behind the EITC. Out here, there's actually some work disincentives because these people get income, and these folks kind of have their wage taxed away because as you make more, your EITC payment falls. So there are some what you might call perverse or not unintended, we knew that, unavoidable adverse effects here on labor supply. These are going to tend to hit, not exclusively, but more likely to hit married women because this is based on family income. If you're married, your family income is likely higher. These pro-work incentives down here are much more likely to hit single mothers. Mothers because you need kids for this to matter, and single because, on average, family income in single-family homes is much lower than in married family homes. We're kind of willing to tolerate, I think I would say, just judging by how much we now spend on this program and how much support it has. We're willing to tolerate maybe some of these women out here working somewhat fewer hours. We don't view that as that big a deal because we seem to think as a society there's tremendous benefits from drawing low-skilled single mothers into the labor market. Whether that's because philosophically you think people should work or because, more coming from my perspective, you think there's positive benefits to work, potentially positive benefits to work in terms of future earnings growth, it doesn't matter. But either way, that is what happens. Okay. So what do we know about the EITC? Well, there are a lot of papers on short-run employment effects. This is probably, I think it's fair to say, this is of all the areas in labor economics I know, the place where the evidence is most unambiguous. There's almost every single study. The only exception I know of is a study of a single expansion in Wisconsin, which is sort of a strange thing. They have a slightly different state policy. Every other study says low-skilled single mothers work more when you make the EITC more generous. Really nobody disputes Again, there's a little bit of work on whether the married mothers work a little less, maybe. They don't leave the labor force, but they might work somewhat fewer hours. And by the way, we use marriage rather than income. You could say, well, why don't we look at what people here do versus what people here do? Well, how much income you have is a choice. I mean, marriage is a choice too, obviously. But it doesn't sort of respond directly to the policy. So that's why there's this, if you're wondering why is this weird breakdown of single and married mothers, that's why, because the single mothers tend to be here where there's positive work incentives, the married mothers out here where there aren't. Okay. And there's a little bit touching again on distributional effects, but it's short term. Just a quick plug, a bit off topic. The EITC has incredibly good distributional effects, right? That's not surprising, by which I mean the money goes to low-income families. That's not surprising because the structure of the program is to send money to low-income families, right? And so that's actually what happens. That contrasts with the minimum wage. Another topic for another day. I gave a lecture about this here a while ago. The minimum wage goes to low-wage workers. And obviously, being a low-wage worker is correlated with being in a low-income family, but it's kind of amazing how weak the correlation is, right? Because a lot of poor families have no workers, so minimum wage doesn't help them, and a lot of minimum wage workers are teenagers who aren't particularly poor. So the EITC has very good distributional effects. Okay. The only long-term study of the that's sort of related to what I'm going to do here is on earnings growth is this study by Gordon Dahl and others, where they look at the expansion. There were big federal expansions in the federal EITC, and I'll show you the chart later in the mid-'90s. They look at those and find positive effects on earnings growth, which they interpret as people are brought in, they accumulate labor market experience, that leads to higher earnings growth, and down the road, women affected by this were earning more. There's a whole other body of work that's emerging on a different kind of long-run effect of the EITC, which is kind of on education and health. And this is really driven by, not by the work incentives, but by the fact that the EITC delivers dollars to poor families if someone works, right? And there's increasingly convincing evidence, I think, and I think you'll have these slides, and that should be an active URL, to an inventory of research that Esprey has about these other kinds of effects on child outcomes, test scores in kind of the short to medium run, child health, actually quite a bit later. So that's another part of long-term effects, which I'm simply not talking about today, but it's potentially important. Okay. So there's ample evidence that the EITC boosts employment of low-skilled single moms in the short run. The key question here is, can we actually find evidence that the sort of long-term exposure to the work incentive effects of the EITC shows up in earnings in the longer run? So does here's one way to think about this, right? So let's hope you believe me that the research says the EITC boosts employment of low-skilled single mothers. So one perspective is, well, yeah, so there's this EITC, it boosts their wage, they go and they work in really crappy jobs, and there's never any wage growth, and no one ever gets ahead, and 20 years later, they're still in the same crappy job because of the EITC, but they haven't really gotten ahead, and they haven't sort of grown out of the EITC. The alternative is that the jobs these women take are like the jobs that most of us have, or the students in the room will have, which is that you start out sometimes at quite low pay, but you have significant earnings growth over time, right? On average, labor economists have evidence that earnings grow around 4% a year, right? Real earnings, especially over the first 15 to 20 years. It's kind of a flattening out later on. But that's probably consistent with what many of you have experienced and what many of you may expect. So the question is, are the jobs that the people affected by these programs can get more like that, so that when we create a work incentive, we actually generate sort of a virtuous cycle of accumulation of experience, accumulation of skills, higher earnings down the road. So that's what we're after. We'll also consider, it's not as big a focus of the paper, but this question of what about the married women who might work a little less? Does that actually have the sort of reverse effect for them? Are they actually earning a little less in the long run because we've created some work disincentives along the way? And the answer will be, yeah, but not quite as strong, and maybe not quite as important. Okay. I'm going to skip this. It's along here. Okay. So what do we do? Briefly, I promise. We use a data set called the Panel Study in Income Dynamics, which is it's a panel data set, which means it follows people over time. Started in the late 1960s, 5,000 families. Most panel data sets aren't really good for studying long-term policy effects because they start with a cohort, like 16 to 25-year-olds. at a point in time, and they follow them as they age. Well, that wouldn't be very helpful because I want to see different women hitting like age 40 or so, exposed to very different policy environments, and if they're all in the same cohort, that doesn't work. The PSID started with these 5,000 or so families, and what's amazing about it is it captures all their offspring. It captures all the, not just offspring, but the families these families spawn, which is also, of course, either kids or marrying in. So it's this ever-growing data set that's kind of over time representative of what this point-in-time snapshot of American families became. And there's some adjustments. They add more minorities, because like we hadn't really heard of Latinos back in the 60s when they started these data sets. It's kind of amazing. You actually go to the 1980 census and try to get a variable for Hispanic. I think 1980, maybe it was 1970, but I think 80 still, it's actually not there. You have to do it off of names. But now data sets obviously have added those populations to be more representative. Anyways, what's nice about this is it's a very long-term data set. We can follow people over decades. So I could see people who were kind of young, unmarried with kids when the federal EITC didn't exist or wasn't very generous, and then I could see other women much later on when the EITC was more generous, kind of going through the 20s and 30s. I can also exploit the state variation of the EITC, of which there's quite a bit. So I'm going to take the PSID data. I'm going to combine it with the historical data on the EITC, and this is a very complicated part of the paper, but only because it was hard to figure out how to do this. But the idea is sort of simple. Imagine two women, right? I want to compare two women, and they may have been hit. We study them from age 22 to 39. That's what we consider their exposure period, and it's partly because when they're younger, we can't really figure out who's answering the questions for the survey. So we're missing some early childbearing, but there's no way to capture it very well. So I've got a bunch of women, or let's say it's two women, and I want to study them from age 22 to 39. I want to kind of characterize what kind of EITC incentives they faced over that whole period. So I want to know, first of all, their marital and childbearing history. When were you married? When were you unmarried? Because the effects could be different for unmarried and married women. And when did you have kids and how many? Right? Because what you could get from the EITC depended on whether you had kids or not. So I'm kind of taking, and then these women may have grown up, may have entered age 22 different periods or in different states, either of which could mean the EITC they faced over that period was more or less generous. So we kind of construct this weighted average of how generous of an EITC you were exposed to, and then we track that for sort of kind of four different states you could be in: unmarried with no kids, unmarried with kids, married with no kids, married with kids, and we accumulate all those effects. So we kind of want to ask the question the following way. If you were exposed to a really generous EITC for a lot of years when you were unmarried and had children, right, then you were somebody who, at least based on the short-run evidence, was facing these positive employment incentives a lot of the time, right, because the EITC was bigger, so it paid more. You were unmarried, so your family income was probably low, and you had kids, so you got something serious from the EITC. If you were without kids most of the time, it doesn't really matter what the EITC was. If you were married with kids most of the time, then you were maybe on the sort of phase-out range. Maybe you faced some work disincentives. So we're going to kind of collect these sort of historical measures for each woman in the sample of her exposure to the EITC. And again, we're going to really track what it was when they were in different marital and childbearing states. That's the idea. It sounds complicated, but when I summarize the results, hopefully it won't be that hard to see what's going on. So we do that effect from ages 22 to 39, actually, and then we study women at around age 40. Why age 40? Nothing magical. It's sort of a balance. If I go to a much older age, I lose observations because not that many people get to that age in the data set. If I go to too young an age, people are still having kids or have young kids in the household. So 40-ish seemed like a rough compromise, but we do some sensitivity analysis, and other ages around 40, we get similar results. The PSID is the only public data I think you could use to do this study, because you need long-term data on lots of people. Some of you may know there's increasing ability to do research with income tax records, and we're working on that. We're trying to get access to IRS records over many decades, which would, of course, be incredible. Confidentiality issues, which we'll work at the IRS. If we can do that, we'll have, fair to say, a much bigger sample. We can get everyone's tax returns. But it may never happen. Okay. So that we already talked about. So the basic idea is what we call in program evaluation, differences and differences. This is actually, whether it's called that or not, you guys have probably come to a lot of these things, hopefully not just for the free lunch, and see a lot of papers about what is the effect of a policy. And whether people define it this way or not, what you see, unless it's like a randomized experiment or something, what you typically are seeing is you have two jurisdictions, the policy changed in one and not the other, right? And maybe you want to say, okay, so if I want to do the effect of the minimum wage on teenage employment, I want to look at states where the minimum wage went up, I want to look at similar states where it didn't, and I want to say what happened to teen employment in the first group versus the second group. Sometimes there's then a second level of differencing, which is let's also think about including data on people who really aren't affected by the policy, because maybe their behavior is going to reflect other stuff you haven't measured that gets confounded with the policy. So it's kind of the idea here. We do exactly what I said for the EITC. We characterize women by how high in EITC they were exposed to, especially when they were unmarried with kids. That's the thing I care about most. But then we also do the low-skilled relative to the high-skilled, because it's probably if you're unmarried with kids and you have a PhD, the EITC probably is quite irrelevant for you, unless you have a PhD in English, then maybe it is. But it's really the high school dropouts, high school grad only, who this really matters for. Because if they're single and have low education, they're almost surely in the earnings range where the EITC is going to matter a lot. So it's just another way of kind of getting more solid evidence. Okay, so with that, we can just jump to some charts and some numbers. This just shows you what the federal EITC looks like. So in the early 1970s, it's simple. There wasn't one, so there's nothing there. Then, starting in the mid-70s, we have the first EITC, which is a 10% EITC credit. Same for anyone with kids. You can't tell that here, but that's one child, one or more children. What does that mean? So the slope of that phase-in range, the percent supplement you get when you first start working, is 10%. That's the credit rate. So if you're making $10,000, you get $1,000 from the government. Then in the mid-'80s, this is the Reagan tax reform. We bump it up a little bit to, I think, 14. There's some research on this period, because relative to this, it looked like a big change, but relative to what came later, kind of irrelevant. And then in the mid-'90s, we get huge changes, right? The credit rate, first of all, we start to differentiate first just a tiny bit by whether you have one kid or two kids. We bring on an EITC for the childless. And by the way, when I say childless, these are what I call tax children, right? Children that the IRS recognizes as your dependents, which is not necessarily the same as whether you had a baby. And then we bump up the credit rate a lot, so it ends up at 34% where it is now for families with one kid, 40% with two kids, and then with the recession ARA, I think it was part of the ARA, we had this additional increment for families with 3+ kids. So that's what the federal EITC looks like. And as I said, it's it's largely replaced traditional cash welfare programs. Robert Moffat, a famous scholar of welfare programs and all that, has coined this phrase, what he calls the work-based safety net, which is meant to be ironic, because a safety net is supposed to be like make sure you have enough to live on. A work-based safety net means we make sure we have enough to live on as long as they're working. But that's what it means to replace cash welfare benefits with the EITC. So it's a whole separate issue, what we do about people not working, for another day. Okay. This is more complicated, but this is meant to give you information on what's going on at the state level. Okay? So at the state level, nothing till the 1980s. And then, first of all, look at the gray boxes. That's the easy one. That's the number of states with their own EITC. California's not in here, actually, because these data end before California's EITC comes online. So we're now, at the end of this sample, 2013, 26 states had their own EITC. I think one state, Kentucky or North Carolina, eliminated theirs, and a few more states have them. But now, just like with minimum wages, a lot of states have just gone ahead and enacted their own policy. Over 30 states now have a minimum wage higher than the federal minimum wage. And these are different measures of the credit rate, but the green line is the average supplement to the federal EITC. So when it's 5 here, that means on average states are saying, we're going to take your federal EITC payment, whatever it is, and give you 5% on top of it. But you can see that some are quite a bit higher. This is the maximum. So some are, at one point they were 50. Some states are now at 40. California, I'm sure there are people who know more, I believe is 80%, an 80% supplement to the federal EITC, which is by far the most aggressive. It's structured a little differently. It's a little odd in some ways. But that's where that is. So a lot of states have their own EITC. So we're using both things. We're using the federal changes, later versus early. The EITC was a lot more aggressive. And then, depending on what state you're in, you're more likely exposed to this additional work incentive. Okay. going to skip that. I'll skip that. So one thing we ask here before we dig in is we're using the PSID, and I said I'm using it because we need this really long-term panel. But it's not that big a data set, right? At the end of the day, because we got to see these women for 20 years and have all kinds of data, we only have a couple thousand people, low-skilled people in the sample, even less. So you might say, well, you told me that there's a lot of evidence on short-run employment effects of the EITC. Can you actually see them in these data? Because this is not the data set people use for the short-run effects, because for that question, there's much bigger data sets available. So you'll kind of always want to ask the question, because we could have done this study and found nothing, and then said, oh, well, there's a short-run effect but no long-run effect, and you might have come back and said, well, are you even using data where you can see the short-run effect? So we spend quite a bit of time seeing whether we can replicate that prior evidence. And in fact, we can. With these data, even though it's a much smaller sample, we can find the same kind of evidence people have found in the past, that, for example, those big federal expansions in the 1990s really did boost employment of low-skilled single mothers in these data. So that's just sort of a preliminary. Okay, I'm going to show you a table which is a mess, although it's color-coded to help you make sense of it. But then I'll show you a figure which cleans it up. But some of you like to wade your way through tables. So let me tell you what we're doing here. We're taking these model estimates, and they're kind of complicated. And at the end of the day, we're boiling them down to comparisons. So I'm going to focus on this number right here. This is 0.187. So think about that as 18.7%, because that's in logs. So that's 18%. And what is this? This is the effect of a 10 percentage. We think about people exposed to a permanently 10 percentage point higher EITC. So like a 40% supplement instead of a 30% supplement, 10 percentage points higher. So we expose them to that based on our model estimates. And then what this is how much higher is their employment at age 40, right? If they had children early, so 2 kids at age 22 and 24, and were never married, relative to the sample averages. So in other words, what does the EITC do to mature adult employment, whatever you want to call age 40? I might be mature by the time I'm 60, but we'll see. What does it do to sort of age 40 employment for those who are really strongly exposed to these positive work incentives? Why are they really strongly exposed? Because they had their kids early and they were unmarried the whole time. So we could do a lot of hypothetical scenarios. There's sort of an infinite number of them, but these are just some we choose to highlight. So this estimate here instead is the early kids never married, actually versus column 2, which is the early kids always married. They have the incentives of anything in the opposite direction. So interestingly, all the numbers that are highlighted in green, which is the second of each of these 4 panels for employment, wages, earnings, and hours, should be positive if the short-term work incentive effects of the EITC actually boost labor market outcomes in the long run, right? So they're not all statistically significant. You can see that with the asterisks, but every single one of them is the right sign, right? And we do a lot of other checks in this paper. I'm kind of amazed, because this is asking a lot of the data. For those of you who work with data at all, you might be getting that sense. We're doing something pretty complicated with a pretty small data set. Then we have this column. So this is now there's a red number in each case. There's only one because it's sort of what doesn't matter. There's only one. So now we're comparing the early kids always married. These are the people most likely to have worked a little less because of the EITC, right? Because they're higher income. We compare them to the sample averages. These might all be negative because they have work disincentives, and actually 3 of the 4 of them are. Okay, so that's kind of what we get. If we can turn it to a much easier to read figure. Where I do the following. There's a bunch of things going on here. So here's that 18.7, by the way. That's that same 0.187 I said before. So this is the effect, on employment, on log wages, log earnings, and hours. And the yellow is people who have early kids and are never married. So there's sort of this hypothetical group of people who should have had really strong pro-work incentives relative to the sample averages. And the orange is the effect of people who should have had, if anything, really strong work disincentives because they were married and had kids all the time, relative to the sample averages. And then the bars are solid if they're statistically significant, and just sort of outlines if they're not. And the yellows are pretty striking, right? Because in every case, you're seeing these positive long-run effects of exposure to a more aggressive EITC. The oranges, as I said, are negative in 3 out of 4 cases, only significant in 1. So that's sort of the main result. I want to talk about I want to say some more things, though, and then interpret. So first of all, if you think about those effects, and I realize we're going fast here, but if you sort of dig into this later, they're really big, right? These are, what does this say? This says women who were exposed to a permanent, that is from 22 to 39, 10 percentage point higher EITC, have wages that are 36% higher at age 40. That's, if it's just from the effect of work experience, so taking estimates I cited before, that a work year of experience is worth 4%, a plausible effect on how many people were more likely to work, you can't get to a number anywhere that nearly that big. So if it's true, it might not be. Right? But if in fact I have a real causal answer, a real answer to the question here, it's got to be because of other things that happen. So when you're going to be working more, you change a lot of other things, not just how much you work, but you make all kinds of investments in finding better jobs and maybe some training and maybe other things we don't measure that really lead to higher earnings. So it's kind of, you have to believe these magnitudes are plausible, you kind of have to believe that the EITC has really shifted the orientation of people towards work. And they make a lot of decisions, aside from just working, that are going to generate higher earnings growth in the long run. There's qualitative evidence by poverty researchers on kind of the, I'm forgetting her name, Kathy Eden and others, on kind of the culture of the EITC versus the culture of welfare. And I don't know if she'd actually buy these estimates, but their work really says that the EITC creates for low-income families it really reinforces a pro-work culture. They go to the welfare office and they get treated with suspicion and disrespect and a lot of checking up and are you really, can you really not work and all this kind of stuff. They go to get their EITC, they don't have to deal with any of that nonsense at all. It's a much simpler system. And it's sort of, and they interview people. It's sort of like, this is great. The government is like saying, we believe in you and investing in our working because they're basically giving us more to work. So maybe that's what's going on. It's a little hard to say for sure. But I do want to point out that the effects are big. And you want to realize that. We do a number of other checks. This is what economists do, make sure we really believe it. I don't want to talk through them now, but I just want, well, I'll list them, but I'll actually talk about the two most important ones. One thing we worry about, and people do, is that the EITC could affect marriage and childbearing behavior, right? We had these discussions with welfare too. Do people have kids in response to a policy? Anyone who has kids would say, you've got to be kidding me. I'm not going to have an extra kid for a few $1,000s a year because it costs a lot more than that. But nonetheless, the economic incentives are there, right? So if you're already working and you can get the EITC, you might have a kid because you can. The evidence we look at in the paper says that doesn't happen. Marriage incentives are different because there also could be incentives to stay unmarried, right? Because your spouse's income won't count as your family income. The decision to marry or not based on economic incentives might be much more malleable, right? Because in a sense, especially these days, the norm of having kids together, even if you're unmarried, is not particularly negative. You might just choose to stay unmarried but live just like a married person. You might share a household, share expenses, share bank accounts. So that could happen, and that could, in principle, make some of our results spurious. We don't find that kind of evidence in the data, though. The other thing you worry about, and this is a big problem when you study the EITC, we talked about those big changes in the mid-1990s, but there were also big changes in welfare in the mid-1990s. So you might be wondering, how in the world do you sort those things out? And we do it a couple ways, and it seems like our results are not driven by welfare changes. We basically create measures of exposure to welfare reform that we treat just like the EITC. How many years were you exposed to welfare reform when you were unmarried with kids, et cetera? Let the two kind of duke it out in the regressions, and the EITC effects really stay kind of the same. Okay. So to conclude, so it looks like exposure to a more generous EITC when women were young and unmarried with children does create some long-run positive effects. Their earnings are higher, their employment is higher, their hours are higher when we look at them at or around 40, and we look at some ages near 40 and see the same thing. A bit of an offsetting effect for women who were exposed to a high EITC when they were married. Again, from the point of view of anti-poverty policy, we care less about that because that's happening to higher income families. We still care about it, but we care if we're really focused on getting more income in the hands of low-income families, this is probably just a price you have to pay because you have to phase out the EITC, but we'd all get it. You can't. There's no other way to do it. These longer-run effects are consistent with what you'd expect if the short-run effects on employment actually lead to sort of accumulation of work experience and skills and what we call human capital. So the answer is not surprising. This is, I mean, you might have expected this. I think what's surprising is that you can detect this in the data at all. It's a hard thing to tease out of the data. It's somewhat surprising how big they are. It doesn't mean I believe my point estimate is exactly the right estimate. But I kind of come away from this, and there's a lot of tables in the paper showing that we can just beat the data a lot of different ways, and this result keeps coming back, that there does seem to be this sort of long-run positive effect. And actually having that evidence, I think, does help inform the debate. We know the EITC is very popular for a lot of reasons. The only reason people have been able to refer to so far is the positive short-run effects. People work more. But if we actually generate earnings growth, right? People actually later down the road are earning more because of the EITC. That's sort of a freebie. I always say the EITC is already kind of like magic dust, because one thing you see on even the short-run effects, we know we can reduce poverty by giving people money. There's no magic to that. Right? We can eliminate poverty tomorrow, right? The EITC, forgetting about the long-run effects, just in the short run, increases the number of families who earn their way out of poverty. So just the effect on their earnings before you get the EITC check. There aren't any, I don't think there's any other policies people know about that do that, at least, sort of almost overnight. But now this says, it seems to do this in the longer run as well, and actually not just raise their current earnings, but generate earnings growth, which means down the road, they'll have higher earnings and less dependence on the EITC as well as other programs.